Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I will be your host for today, Leah Troscianecki, and I am joined today by my esteemed colleagues, Jeff and Jason. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Hello,
Delighted to be here.
Absolutely. And, ultimately, whether you're calling into us today from breakfast, it's about lunchtime for me here in the United States, or hopefully it's happy hour for some of you guys, and you can make happy hour whenever you want it. That is actually going to be our theme for today. We are going to be pretending, astral projecting out to London, the UK, perhaps Scotland. We didn't want to start any FC fights, so we're going to just be nondescript with where we're calling in from. But all of us have some fun pub backgrounds for you guys today, because when we were thinking about this week's topic, we wanted to spend some time really decompressing from the last couple of weeks, because boy, have we been in unprecedented times. Haha. And in fact, if you haven't been on Reddit, X, Facebook, if you don't get carrier pigeons, you may not know that we are actually in the midst of yet another major outage. Microsoft has reported outages of significant service delivery across Azure, M365, Power Apps, all stemming from a networking issue. So we'll talk a bit about that today, talk a bit about what we experienced a couple weeks ago, and even recount some really fun stories over the years of different kinds of outages that we've all experienced, whether they are human-made. There's even going to be a rat in one of these stories, if I can go ahead and tease something there. So we'll talk about some of the outages that we've all experienced. And then again, talk about kind of some of these lessons learned that we've experienced over the years, because we can keep looking behind us and saying, wow, this is unprecedented. This was a bizarre sequence of events. But if that becomes the norm, then what do you do with that, right? How do you then just recognize that this is the reality and we all need to be prepared for the unprecedented? So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. Before we get started with that, I do just want to mention that we'd love to hear from where you all are reaching us from, whether you're on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, wherever. Drop a comment in on that chat to let us know where you're calling in from. One of the things we love to do here is to light up a map that we have from around the world. So we'll do that in just a couple of minutes. Go ahead and drop some of those in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, because one of the cool things about this sort of experience is a lot of these outages have become worldwide. So it really connects us together, stops being a local problem and starts being something that we can all band together on. So please drop in the chat where you're calling in from us today. And before we get to that map, let's go ahead and set the stage. Let's do some table stakes here. Jason, I want to bring you in on this because, of course, on the market research side, Veeam has a big passion for having market research as part of our day-to-day motions. And as part of the Data Protection Trends Report, we actually asked, what were some of the most common experiences that you had with outages, and what were the most impactful? So Jason, walk us through some of this data and some of the insights that we saw a couple months ago when we were going through this report.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. So, I've been in data protection now for 35 years. It's the only thing I've pretty much done since getting out of school. And it's always come down to, you got to plan for the bad things to happen. Right. And so one of the most quintessential questions that you always ask is, okay, what kind of bad things have happened lately? Because that's what you need to be building for. And I think in 2024, it would be very easy to say, it's all about cyber. In fact, some of the folks that try to compete with Veeam, they've said they're security companies. Well, my answer to that, by the way, is if you're only protecting against flood, so you've got watertight walls, you've got no pipes nearby, and then you have a fire, you're not going to have any water around. And I think some folks over-rotate towards the idea of we're just having to solve IT versus cyber. So one of the questions we ask is, tell us all the different kinds of things that brought down IT services and therefore impacted business process. And those are the blue lines that you see on that right-hand side. And yeah, by the way, cyber is top of the list for a fourth year in a row, most common cause of an outage. And then we also ask, okay, so of all the outages, because you're going to notice those blue lines add up to way more than 100%, right? So more than one thing causes an outage per year. But then what was the thing that caused the most impactful outage of the year? And those are the warm lines. And for 4 years running, cyber was top of mind. So you could easily just fixate on the top of that and say, we're going to be a cyber company and it's going to be great. But here's the problem. No matter how much you protect against cyber, fire still happens. Flood still happens, hurricanes still happen, and databases still crash, and users still delete stuff. And I mean, all the other things still go on along the way. And I think this is probably a pretty nice backdrop for let's talk about some of the other things that continue to go wrong in our world. It's not just about cybersecurity. Can I get an amen from my colleagues at the bar?
Absolutely. Amen
Absolutely.
here. Yep.
Time for a shot. So I've been doing this also a long time, and I have to say, my first job in the data center was running backups to tape on a great big IBM RISC system, running backups for an entire data center, including mainframes. And something happened to us in October 1996. And for those of you whose career with tech runs back that far, you'll remember there was this new thing called the internet back then. I was in the Stanford data center, and a rat chewed through a power transfer cable between our on-campus cogeneration power facility and the utility. And it was very bad news for Mr. Rat, unfortunately for him, but it was also bad news for our data center because everything went down hard. And I got to spend about 3 days recovering systems that had crashed from backup tapes. Ultimately, it went great. I had my I Survived the Rat Attack t-shirt, which lasted literally for 25 years until I had to retire it. But that was my first experience, and it had nothing to do with cyber. Interestingly, it wasn't just Stanford resources, because we had such a good data center that a few other small outside organizations like the LA Times and others had put the web presences in our data center. So it was kind of a larger outage, which is kind of reminiscent of, Leah, what you just talked about that we're going through right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels very similar, especially in its sort of scale. And sometimes that scale can be incredibly painful. I remember back in 2016, I was all the way out in Prague. I had been at a series of meetings from Veeam, and then I took a friend of mine and toured Prague and spent lots of time walking around Castletown until one minute when we were sitting at the vineyard that is on the edge of Castletown, looking at the beautiful city, and we got an alert saying that Delta was experiencing a significant outage. And of course, now we know that there was an actual power outage that had happened at their primary data center. So really what can go wrong will go wrong, I think was one of those big lessons even from back then. That was a real national news making kind of event. And it caused significant chaos for so many people in their day-to-day lives. I was delayed an entire day. I really had to learn how to survive. I managed to get back to JFK, but we missed our connection to Columbus. And I had to spend the night at a very scary Radisson. It was not great. Ultimately, I think that these become really good lessons learned of things that can go wrong. And of course, I have my experience working in cloud technology. So I can sit here on my mighty horse and say, well, cloud providers tend to have redundant power, so that may not happen. Funny enough, here's where we're at. We have a global reliance on cloud services, and we're seeing such significant outages creating these exact kind of scenarios. And we can sit here and point fingers at individual cloud providers, but frankly, all of them have had news-making outages. I know, Jeff, when we were preparing for today's session, we were talking about an outage that maybe not everyone hears about, but it was back in February and it affected Google Cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I shared with the audiences at a couple of sessions that I did back at Veeam On. But for those of you who didn't follow it, there is an Australian pension fund that has about $135 billion of assets under management for Australian college professors and school teachers still employed and retired. They went all in on Google Cloud. And unfortunately, there was a configuration error when their tenant was set up that included an expiration date. And when the expiration date came for their tenant, all the redundancy that they had, all the replication between multiple regions and multiple data centers, all the backups that they had for their subscription didn't matter because the subscription, the backups, the redundancy, everything got zapped. It's actually a regulatory success story because obviously a pension fund is in the financial services range. This is for public sector folks. It's heavily regulated. They had to have backups out of their tenant. They went down, it was actually in May, early May this year, May 2nd. Their full restoration of services didn't happen until May 15th. But if you think of an outage that covers the accounts of over 600,000 people, representing $135 billion in assets having to be reconstituted from backups, an outage where full services weren't restored for just under 2 weeks is a success story. And it's a success story because regulatory compliance forces good behavior. And in this case, it gave them something to fall back to.
Really a tremendous story, and certainly one that I hope our community can kind of take back and really think about, especially when you're thinking about your own personal outage scenarios. And we'll keep talking about some of those, and we'd love to hear from you all in the chat about that. Speaking of folks in the chat, we just wanted to kind of give a quick update on some technical difficulties. If you were trying to stream in from LinkedIn, if you want to go back, we're back on LinkedIn. So if you jumped and joined us from a different platform, you're more than welcome to go back to LinkedIn. It is functional again. And with that, I also would love to kind of do a programming note, because as I mentioned, we have a really fabulous map feature where we can hear more from where you guys are calling in from. So we'll go ahead and light that map up, and we're really pleased to have folks from all over the world joining us. Here in the United States, we have production and team members here from Texas, Ohio, and Connecticut. Whoop, whoop. We also have some folks joining us from California and Utah. So good morning, happy breakfast time for you guys. You're welcome to put whatever you'd like in your cup. We're not going to tell you one way or the other. Over in Europe, it is, of course, happy hour for you all. So thank you for joining us from Portugal, Italy, and the UK. All of those countries are having great showings in, of course, the Olympics that we've been watching lately, including Brazil. I was really awesome.
Hey.
I was really excited to watch the gymnastics team from Brazil be competing the other day, and I believe the team finals are happening right now. So thank you again for joining us. Please keep joining us in the chat to let us know where you're calling in from and to share some of your own outage stories. To bring this back to our group here, I think that Jeff highlighted this really intense cloud outage experience. And of course, we're experiencing an outage that is really significant right now. So Jason, do you want to talk to us a little bit about, what we're seeing in this outage today?
Yeah, so we talked about Jeff's example from Google Clouds. Like, well, certainly by now they figured that out. And Leah, you mentioned earlier, well, clouds, they have this uptime. Cloud is not a silver bullet against downtime, right? That is just somebody else's data center. There's a different economic model. There are some really smart humans that are running those data centers at scale, but let's be clear, it's a data center, right? And so you make a mistake, or a configuration error, which, by the way, was one of the examples from earlier. We're going to revisit that later in the session, and things go bad. And so for those of us that have a lot of free time and are watching the live stream today, for some of y'all, it's because you can't log into 365 or any other service that's dependent on Entra ID. And I'm saying that with a little bit of hyperbole in effect. We love Microsoft. Some of us are even Microsoft's alums, but this is the active screenshot right now. So remember, so according to the DPR 2024 data, nearly 1 in 3 organizations said they had outages based on a lack of access to public cloud resources. That's what that lovely blue line from our chart from above looks like, right? So 31%, 1 out of 3. And, oh, by the way, for about 1 out of 10 organizations for the last 3 years, 9%, 10%, 8%, for 1 out of 10, that interruption of service not being able to get to a public cloud was the cause of the most impactful financial outage of the year for them. And guess what? We're in one right now. Right. So this is what the stats look like across the world. Jeff, you had some of the most prophetic and technical commentary on this particular dashboard. I wrote it down just because it was so impactful. I'm going to use this again. Tell me again what you said on this one.
Well, what I said when I looked at this dashboard is that's a lot of red triangles spread out there if you look down. Though I will, spoiler alert, the red triangles aren't everywhere. There is some good news in the picture if you look, and we'll get to that in just a second. Leah pointed it out. So yeah, that's an awful lot of red triangles there. It doesn't matter really what region you're in. If the network is down, then you're in trouble. And one service in particular that was affected by this, of course, is Entra ID, your ability to authorize and log in. Jason, any thoughts about how that might be affecting folks?
Yeah, let's double click on that. So I clicked on the Americas just so you could get a deeper lens on this one, but it was actually true across Europe and APJ as well. So for all of you, wherever you're dialing in from, unless you're either in Washington, D.C. Or Alexandria, Virginia, you're pretty much having a cruddy day. But you can look down here, and if you scroll down on this chart, everything is green except for infrastructure. Right. So ask, Jeff, you and I have both been doing this 25, come on upwards on 30 years. I'm leaving Leah out of this because I'm referring to the gray hair. But, other than DNS and Active Directory back when everything was on-prem, I can't think of anything that touches more things than anything else. I guess my commentary for this, and for the kids at home, write this down, right? So, we had the joke for years, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, did it make a sound, right? Well, if you can't authenticate to a service because Entra ID is down, does it really matter that everything else is green check marks? Jeff,
Yeah.
what are you thinking here?
Exactly. And I know we said we weren't going to talk about cyber today, but we do talk to a lot of folks about cyber-related outages, about ransomware and cyber extortion and cyber attack-related outages. And one consistent thing that ties in very closely to this Entra ID conversation is that one of the most critical things that folks have to protect, and the long pole in the tent frequently before they can begin restoring services after a cyber attack or after an outage, is your authentication, your Active Directory framework, right? It matters and it's critical. And we've spent a lot of time, and there's been a lot of ink spilled and a lot of conversations about zero trust and about narrowing the authentication and the authorization and the security frameworks that you're using, not trusting by default, but all the frameworks that I need to use to make sure that I'm only giving required access to folks and to applications and to workloads that need it, and only for the time that they need it and the location that they need it, relies on being able to authenticate in the first place, right? Yep. So it is critical.
Yeah. Now, again, we don't want to bash anybody. Everybody has outages, right? So Amazon has had their share. Google's had their share. We happen to be in the middle of an Azure one today. The list goes on and on. We will give some positive news. As I said, if you happen to be in the Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia area, and you are working off of GovCloud is working just fine for the United States and certainly for everything DoD and the folks that are across the way. We are glad for that. So yeah, so there is some positive news on that. But again, let's just kind of double back to there's a lot of other things that cause outages. It is also worth pointing out to our friends over in the old country, especially if you are enjoying Greenwich Mean Time, for all of the outages and crises that you might have, congratulations, it is 5 o'clock for you. So hopefully you're getting a chance to enjoy that. I used to joke with folks, there are two things that every IT pro needs to have in their disaster recovery plan. They need to have an updated resume, and they need to have a bottle that is still has some contents left in it. That's why, as those of us who are seasoned as executives, we know never to bring a transparent glass with us on camera. So that's how I get through my. Yeah, see, Leah, you're going to learn.
I'll learn
over
someday.
time, or you go with gin, which I know is Jeff's proof of. I prefer the bourbons myself, but we celebrate diversity here at Veeam. Anyway, so differences in thought. All right, can we go back to all the other things that can go bad as far as outages go? Who has another story that we want to do? Because otherwise, I created 2 outages, and so I can certainly pile those on.
I think you should talk about those, right? Because one of the big things we talk about here at Veeam is people, process, and tech. We've talked about rats, we've talked about other actors, but I think, there's a very real reality that there are going to be human-made errors. We've all experienced that. I remember in my first job ever as a seller, I accidentally uploaded a lead list wrong with the first names and last names switched, and they spent hours rolling back our CRM. And as a 22-year-old that was very afraid of being fired from that was not a fun feeling. But that was just a simple database. That they were laughing at me for how afraid I was. Jason, I think you've got a story that maybe isn't quite as laughable in the moment.
Oh yeah, no,
Hindsight,
I've got a
hilarious.
couple. But since you had one where the first and last name were inverted, here's a version of that same thing. I was also probably 22, 23. I was dispatched to go and repair a storage array in a data center. And one of the arrays had gone offline, but of course, because we are all about resilience, even back in 1994, even back then. So they had synchronous storage. They had 2 copies of the disk. Well, one of them had completely failed. My job was to reconstitute the failed array and then get them mirrored again. It turns out if you type in the mirroring command, mirror 1, 0, as opposed to mirror 0, 1, you're actually defining which one is the source and which one is the target. So unlike inverting first and last name, I inverted clean storage array overwrites valid storage array. And so now both of them were equally clean, and all the data was gone. So that's one of 2 where I literally blew up data, which is why I now have a career in backup. The other one was we had to do a catastrophic complete server rebuild from scratch. Now, of course, being the overzealous person that I was, I went to last night's backup. I asked the admin, hey, what was something you worked on yesterday? Let's make sure it's there. I restored the file from the restore. Yep, good to go. Okay, now we can go ahead and wipe the servers and go from there. We wiped the servers. I restored the data. Check that file again. It's all good. I'm walking out the door. I'm expecting high fives, right? Celebrations. Hey, he built the server again. And turns out everyone else in the office said, wait, where's my data? Wait, where's my data? Turns out the account used for backup was not an admin account. And so the only home directory that had been backed up for 6 months was the admin whose stuff I had checked. And no one else had any other data. So there's all kinds of admin caused errors, even of the brightest 23-year-olds out there can cause outages overall. Anyone else have any, oops, I may get fired for this comments?
Well, I'll share another cloud outage this is from about 4.5 years ago, and we haven't talked specifically about AWS yet. So this is a power outage in an AWS data center in August 2019, and it led to the very frequent set of cascade failures that I think that we have all dealt with at various points in our career, but it also led to a tweet on what was then called Twitter by a sysadmin named Andy Hunt, who described the problem. His company had lost data, and ended his tweet with, reminder, the cloud is just a computer in Reston with a bad power supply. So he won the internet that day, in my opinion, and I think it's good for all of us to remember, even as we get better at protecting things, even as resiliency goes up, durability goes up, uptime goes up, we still need to take care of and prepare for a computer in Reston with a bad power supply, or a once in a lifetime misconfiguration event that takes down 600,000 retirement accounts.
With 1 line of code.
With 1 line of code.
Hey, I could do that with a command line. I didn't even need a whole line of code. It was just, resync 0, 1, enter. Oh. So, hey, one more outage, and this one's kind of fun. We talk a lot about technology, right? But Leah, you said it perfectly that, for business process to happen requires people and process and tech, right? So I was telling one of the IT pros that works at a cloud provider, also happens to be my kid, different story. But we were talking about different kinds of outages going on. He said, are you going to mention the Star Wars outage of 1999? I'm a Star Wars fan. What do you mean Star Wars outage? He said, oh yeah, May 19th, 1999. And I said, what was the outage? He said, well, that was the first day that episode 1 debuted in theaters. Now, you got to remember, way back then, no one had actually seen a Star Wars movie in a theater in like nearly 20 years, right? Now, it was 17 years, actually. So 2.2 million IT pros, or I guess employees in general, all called in sick on May 19th, unexpectedly. They all got the same virus so they could go see opening day. Now, I don't know if those numbers match with like Avengers Endgame or last Thursday for Deadpool and Wolverine. By the way, if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely fantastic. But the idea that people would just abandon their work to go and actually watch a movie, and millions of people responded. It's amazing what we underestimate in what would happen if the people weren't at their desks for a day. Amen?
Amen. And I think we would probably experience something similar today if we had really monolithic pop culture events like we did back then. But I think with everything being spread out so much, maybe we're diversifying our risk there. Just maybe. But, ultimately, everyone deserves a day off. And I think that's become kind of a resounding cry that we've been hearing, especially over the last couple of months. One of the things that Veeam has been doing locally is running some of these personal resilience roundtables where we've talked a bit about, the kind of personal toll that a lot of this has been taking, right? This idea that if every day is an unprecedented event, how can you live your life on a swivel like that? And Jason, I know that we've got, some really great data about where people are at with their data protection careers, and in particular, maybe a sign of some burnout. So whether you're in this community with us or you're an IT leader and you've got some people you're managing who do data protection, I think this is a really important takeaway from our topic today.
Yeah, so again, this was 1,200 organizations worldwide, and we ask a lot of questions about what the org is doing here, what the IT team is doing there. This question was specifically to the IT leader that was in the survey, and the question was, how likely is it that you will seek a new job outside of your current org within the next 12 months? And 47%, nearly half, said yes, either I definitely will or very likely. So nearly half. By the way, about 6 weeks after this data published, LinkedIn did their own survey of likelihood to change jobs, and they cut it by industry. And of the IT pros in the LinkedIn survey, any guesses on what percentage plan of IT pros, according to LinkedIn, said they're going to change jobs? Any guesses? Any guesses?
I know how great our research is, Jason.
47%, right? You got to love when data matches data, right? So now here's the thing. When we typically talk about that, as, hey, you had a cyber event. You expected the smartest kids in the room to all put on superhero capes and help you get out of that. Well, if 3 weeks before that cyber event, your biggest superhero put in 2 weeks notice, it's not their problem anymore. Right. And so there's a huge amount of vulnerability that comes from you may not have the skills you need when you need them. The inverse of that, by the way, is there's a lot of good talent on the street, but do not underestimate the importance of people within your process. They might actually cause your outage inadvertently or not be there to help you when you need to fix your outage. And maybe that's a good way for us to finish our time.
Absolutely, especially given such great engagement from our community. We got a great comment from Gamil talking a bit about his experience with the blue screen of death, something being frozen in place for 3 hours. We've all been there. We all totally get it, right? We understand the kind of turmoil that can send you into and the panic, especially when you have to balance things like job security and, growing your life and things that are in your actual personal life that you really care about. So we're totally with you, and we're really glad that we got this time today to talk about pouring one out for these unprecedented events, especially if you've been impacted by any of these recent outages. Our hearts go out to you guys as you've been trying to combat some of these issues. We hope that you have felt supported by the Veeam team. I'd love to throw up that map one more time if we've got time, just to kind of show where some other folks have called in from. Again, thank you so much for letting us know where you've been joining us from, because we really appreciate this community aspect. Jason, Jason name dropped Virginia a couple times. That is my home state. So thank you so much for a few folks joining us from Virginia, as well as from Mississippi. We had someone calling from Mississippi, which is fantastic. We had some other engagement from a few other parts of the world, including Jamaica. Over in Europe, we had someone from Denmark, a few folks from Romania, Turkey, which is a fantastic country. Thank you so much for joining us from all over where you're calling in from. Next week, we will be joining you guys for a really fantastic episode. But if you can't get enough of Veeam, we actually have another live stream on Thursdays called Tech Bites, and they're going to be celebrating our most recent hackathon. So in the spirit of community, can't be a better episode about community than a good old-fashioned hackathon. So please join the Veeam team on Thursday. And otherwise, we look forward to connecting with you guys next week. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.